David Whitman stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, staring blankly at the skyline of New York City, his thoughts swirling in a storm of frustration. Below him, the city thrummed with life, the pulse of ambition, desire, and dreams. And yet up here, all he could feel was a hollow emptiness that no amount of wealth or power could fill. At 28, he had everything a man could ask for: a flourishing business, a name that carried weight in the corporate world, and a future that seemed to have been mapped out for him by the very people who had raised him. But none of it mattered. Not when his life had become a series of obligations rather than choices. The weight of his family's expectations pressed down on him like a suffocating cloud. His father, the patriarch of the Whitman Empire, had never been one for sentimentality or emotional nuance. To him, everything was about legacy, power, and maintaining control. And now, David was to marry. Not for love, not for happiness, but for business. This was the price of privilege, he thought bitterly. In the Whitman family, you didn't get to choose your path. You followed it. You made sacrifices, and you ensured the future of the family name. This, of course, was all part of the deal. Marrying someone who could solidify the business and uphold the Whitman reputation. No questions asked. No room for romance. His parents had already arranged it all. He hadn't even been given the courtesy of meeting her before the engagement was set. A woman he had never met. A woman whose face he had never seen. Just the name. Olivia Hargrove. A respected, reputable family, they told him. A family with connections. A family that could strengthen the Whitman legacy. David's jaw clenched as the reality of it all hit him again. An arranged marriage. An agreement. A transaction. That was how he saw it. That was how it had been sold to him. No love, no passion, just duty. It felt like a cruel joke, an insult to his very existence. How could anyone expect him to live this way? To give up his freedom, his agency for some business deal wrapped in the guise of tradition? His life wasn't his own. It never had been. And now it was being handed over to a woman he didn't know, couldn't possibly know, because he wasn't allowed to know her. But there was more. The secrecy surrounding this woman, the veil, the whispers, the careful avoidance of details. Why the secrecy? What was she hiding? What was so mysterious about her? They told him she was from a good family, but good families didn't need to hide their daughters behind veils, did they? It was as though his future wife was a riddle, and all he had were questions. David had spent countless sleepless nights wondering about her. What could possibly justify all of this secrecy? Was she disfigured? Was there something about her that would shock him once he finally laid eyes on her? A scar, a deformity. Something so hideous that even the Hargroves, the people who had supposedly raised her, felt the need to conceal it? The thought gnawed at him, turning his stomach. He had tried to brush it off, but the more he thought about it, the more the frustration grew. This wasn't fair. This wasn't his life. Why couldn't he have a choice? Why was he being treated like a pawn in a game of high society? Tomorrow he would meet her. Tomorrow the mystery would end. Tomorrow he would finally face Olivia, the woman he was supposed to marry, the woman his family had chosen for him. And then he would decide. Would he accept the situation, resigning himself to this fate? Or would he fight it, fight for his own future, his own choices? David poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat down by the large window, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. The bitterness of the drink did nothing to dull the sharpness of his thoughts. He had never been a man who enjoyed being told what to do. And yet here he was, trapped in a situation where he had no say. The more he thought about it, the more he wanted to lash out, to refuse, to walk away. But what was he supposed to do? What was the right thing? Was he supposed to accept this, to smile and pretend that everything was fine, that his parents knew what was best for him? Or was he supposed to stand up for himself, to demand the freedom he'd been denied his entire life? Tomorrow he would meet Olivia. Tomorrow he would see her face. And that would be the moment that everything changed. As the hours ticked by, David found himself drifting into sleep, but the questions wouldn't leave him. Would she be beautiful? Would she live up to the image he had constructed in his mind of the woman he was supposed to marry? Or would she be a disappointment? A symbol of everything he hated about his life, his family, his duty, his lack of agency. He woke up the next day with the same knot of dread in his chest. His father had insisted that he be at the estate by 6 o'clock sharp, to meet the woman who was now his fiancée. There was no escaping it, no room for rebellion. This was his life now. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind full of resentment, he dressed in his finest suit, ready to meet his fate. The Whitman estate was as grand and intimidating as ever. The towering walls of the mansion seemed to loom over him, each brick a reminder of his family's legacy, each door a barrier to the life he had imagined for himself. His parents had already prepared everything. The meal was set, the staff ready, the guests, family friends, business partners, and society elites awaiting his arrival. David walked into the dining room, where his father and mother were seated, at the head of the long table, smiling expectantly. They were both dressed to the nines, as if the evening was just another normal family event. His mother greeted him with a tight-lipped smile, while his father nodded curtly, his eyes betraying no emotion. "David," his father said, gesturing for him to sit. "You've met Anna before, of course. She will be here shortly." David gritted his teeth but said nothing, taking his seat at the table. The silence in the room was thick, heavy, and oppressive. The air seemed to hang with anticipation, not of a joyous event, but of a business deal being sealed. The clock ticked on, and finally, the moment arrived. The sound of heels clicking on the marble floor cut through the tension. David turned, his breath catching in his throat as he saw her. A woman entered the room, her figure graceful and composed. She was draped in an elegant gown, and her face was obscured by a veil, the fabric falling softly over her shoulders. David couldn't see her face, but there was something in the way she carried herself, something that made him pause. Her presence was commanding, even without her revealing her identity. His curiosity flared, and despite himself he felt a flicker of something else. It was fleeting, but it was there. And then she lifted her head, and her eyes met his. They were striking, piercing grey eyes that seemed to look right through him, as though she could see into his soul. For a moment David was frozen, his breath caught in his throat. This was her, the woman his parents had chosen for him, the woman he had resented and assumed to be a mystery. And in that moment he realized that nothing about this would be as simple as he had imagined. Not the marriage, not the woman, not even his own heart. The veil she wore was not a symbol of mystery. It was a challenge to everything he had thought he knew about himself, about what was expected of him, and about the life he had been forced to live. She was here, and everything was about to change. David's heart beat heavily in his chest as he stood in the grand dining room, his thoughts spinning like the chandeliers overhead. He had been told his whole life that he had to adhere to the expectations of his family, to carry the Whitman name with pride, and to never question the decisions made for him. But tonight was different. Tonight he was expected to marry a woman he had never met, someone his parents had handpicked for him. And there were no alternatives. His father, the head of the Whitman family empire, had arranged this marriage with little regard for David's feelings. It was nothing more than a strategic move to secure the family business and legacy, and David was expected to accept it without protest. His mother, always the dutiful partner to his father, had reinforced the decision, reminding David that this was the way things had always been done. They had a vision for his future, and it didn't involve his opinion. David had protested, of course. He had voiced his frustration, his resentment, but it had all been in vain. His objections were swept away as if they were nothing more than the rebellious tantrums of a spoiled child. He had been told time and time again that duty was more important than happiness, and love had no place in the Whitman legacy. He wasn't meant to fall in love. He was meant to marry, secure the family's business alliances, and continue building an empire. And now, here he was, sitting at the head of the table, waiting for a woman he had never met. His thoughts were consumed with questions. What would she be like? Would she be as cold and distant as the arranged marriage itself? Would she, like him, feel trapped by the expectations of others? Or would she surprise him? The sound of heels clicking against the marble floor sliced through his thoughts, and he looked up, startled. There she stood at the entrance of the dining room. Anna. His eyes locked onto her, and for a brief moment his breath caught in his throat. She was tall, her posture elegant, and her figure perfectly composed as she walked into the room. But it wasn't her height or grace that made his pulse race. It was the veil. She wore a long flowing veil that obscured her face entirely, and it immediately intrigued him. What was behind it? What was she hiding? Was this a part of some tradition, or was it a deliberate attempt to distance herself from him, from that situation? His mind raced with possibilities, some practical, some far more speculative. Why would she wear a veil if there was nothing to hide? Anna stopped at the head of the table, and without a word her father, an elderly man with graying hair and a commanding presence, guided her to the seat next to David. The air in the room shifted. The tension seemed to thicken. David had expected a great many things from tonight, but he had not anticipated this. He had thought his frustration would continue to simmer, that the cold formality of the event would remain as it had been planned. But this was different. There was something in her presence that felt real, something that stirred a strange mix of curiosity and discomfort inside him. His parents exchanged brief polite pleasantries with Anna's father, and David remained silent, his eyes fixed on the woman before him. She had not yet removed the veil, nor had she spoken. The weight of her silence was almost unbearable. His father, ever the pragmatic businessman, continued the conversation, but David's attention was unwavering. It was as though a magnetic force had pulled his gaze toward her, and he couldn't look away, even though he knew he should. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Anna spoke. Her voice was soft, but it had a calm authority that seemed to fill the room. "It's a pleasure to meet you, David," she said, her tone measured without any trace of hesitation. David's heart skipped a beat and he tried to compose himself. He had expected something cold, maybe even dismissive, but her words, though brief, carried an unexpected warmth. "Likewise," he muttered, his voice betraying none of the confusion he was feeling. His fingers tightened around the edge of his wine glass, and he forced himself to take a sip, if only to steady his nerves. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of small talk and polite exchanges. David's mind, however, was anything but focused on the dinner. His eyes kept returning to Anna, to the way she moved with such grace, the way she remained so poised and composed in a situation that, for both of them, must have been uncomfortable. There was a quiet strength in her presence, something that made David question all the assumptions he had made about her before meeting her in person. Her responses were measured, her words calculated, but there was no hint of the cold, distant woman he had imagined. In fact, there was something deeply intriguing about her, something that went beyond her appearance and the mystery that the veil created. She didn't seem to be hiding behind it out of shame or insecurity. No, it was more like she was choosing not to reveal herself to him. Not yet, at least. David's frustration began to shift. It was replaced by an unfamiliar feeling, curiosity. He found himself wondering who she really was. Who was the woman behind the veil? What was she thinking, feeling? Why did she choose to wear it? Unable to resist, David turned to her midway through dinner. His voice was low but edged with impatience. "You don't have to keep that on, you know," he said, his words more forceful than he had intended. "No one here is going to judge you." Anna's eyes flicked toward him, but she remained unfazed. She was calm as always, her demeanor steady and unbroken. "I appreciate your concern," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I prefer to keep it on." David's eyebrow arched, the frustration creeping back into his chest. "Why?" he pressed, leaning forward. "Why are you hiding behind it?" His mother shot him a warning glance, but Anna, as always, remained composed. She didn't flinch, didn't show the slightest sign of being intimidated by his questions. "I'm not hiding anything," she replied simply, her gaze steady. "It's just a matter of choice, David. Not everything needs to be seen." David felt the air between them grow heavy. It wasn't the answer he had expected, but somehow it was the one that made the most sense. There was a purpose behind her actions, something deliberate, something calculated. She wasn't hiding, she was choosing not to reveal herself. To him, at least. "And yet," David muttered, more to himself than to her, "it feels like you're hiding something." Anna's gaze softened, but only slightly. "What I wear doesn't define who I am," she said. "And neither does this marriage." Her words cut through him like a knife. There it was again. Her calm, unyielding certainty. She wasn't just a woman who had agreed to an arranged marriage. She was someone who had taken control of her life in a way David had never thought to. She had a quiet power, an unspoken authority, that seemed to command respect, even in the most delicate of situations. David leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. For the first time, he felt like he was meeting someone who understood the weight of this arrangement better than he did. Anna wasn't just playing the role of the dutiful bride. She was standing firm in her own identity, her own choices, and that was the moment that David realized something he hadn't expected. The woman behind the veil wasn't just hiding from the world. She was hiding from him because she didn't trust him yet. David's chest tightened as the truth of that realization hit him. All his assumptions about Anna, about their marriage, had been based on the surface. He hadn't bothered to ask the right questions, hadn't tried to understand her. He had been too focused on his own anger and disappointment, too wrapped up in his own resentment to see what was right in front of him. As the evening wore on, David's mind shifted from frustration to curiosity. He found himself wondering about Anna, about the woman behind the veil, about the person who had been chosen for him in a world where love didn't exist, only duty and expectation. The questions multiplied in his head. What was her past like? Why had she chosen to marry him? What did she really want from this arrangement? Was it just a duty for her too? Or was there something deeper beneath the surface? And perhaps most importantly, who was she really? Tomorrow David would find out. The veil would come off, and the woman he had been forced to marry might just turn out to be more than he ever expected. David sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the cold, polished surface of the table. The evening had been a delicate dance of etiquette and restraint, but in the silence between him and Anna, the air felt thick with unspoken words. His mother, ever the gracious hostess, had tried to fill the space with polite conversation, but David's mind had wandered, his gaze constantly returning to the woman across from him, the woman who was now his fiancée. Her veil, as it had been the entire evening, remained firmly in place, an impenetrable barrier between them. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the sound punctuating the tension in the room. David couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. He had been told by his parents over and over again that this marriage would be the best thing for the family. But none of their assurances made the feeling of emptiness inside him go away. They saw it as an alliance, a merger in the language of business, but he had a hard time seeing it that way. He wasn't marrying a stranger for love. He wasn't marrying for companionship. He was marrying for duty. But Anna was different from what he had expected. She wasn't the meek, silent woman he had imagined would submit to this arrangement. No, she was composed, confident, and most importantly, she had an air of mystery that drew him in, whether he liked it or not. She had refused to take off her veil throughout the entire dinner, and even when she had spoken, her words had been measured, careful, almost as if she were testing him, as if she were waiting for something. When she had turned her gaze to him, earlier there was something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't the cold indifference he had imagined. It wasn't disdain or detachment. It was something far more complicated. She seemed to be studying him just as he was studying her. He couldn't help it. He had to ask. It was the question that had been burning at the back of his mind since the moment he saw her. And in the thick silence of the room, with nothing but the sound of their breathing between them, he found himself blurting it out. Why the veil? The words hung in the air, awkward, yet carrying the weight of his confusion and his growing curiosity. Anna didn't flinch. She didn't even look away. She simply tilted her head slightly, as if she had been waiting for the question. Her voice, when it came, was calm, but there was a quiet strength in it that made David pause. "I've always worn it," she said simply, her eyes meeting his with a steady gaze. "It's my choice." David leaned forward, his frustration mounting. "But why? Why hide behind it? Don't you think it only makes things worse?" Anna's eyes softened, but her expression remained composed. "What I wear doesn't define who I am," she said. "This veil is not to hide behind. It's simply a part of who I am. And as for making things worse, sometimes people don't need to see everything. Not yet, at least." David blinked, momentarily taken aback. Her words felt like an answer, yet at the same time they only raised more questions. Why did she feel the need to wear a veil? What was she hiding? Or more accurately, what was she protecting? David couldn't understand it. He had grown up in a world where appearances mattered, where everything was about projecting the right image, power, wealth, and success. But Anna was different. She was reserved, intentional with her words and actions, and that made her stand out even more. The conversation turned away from the veil, but David couldn't stop thinking about it. He had been raised to see marriage as a partnership, a business transaction, and something to be honored for the sake of family. But here he was, questioning. Everything. Why had he never asked for more? Why had he allowed himself to be swept along by the currents of his family's expectations without once considering his own desires, his own happiness? And now, with Anna, with this woman who wore a veil not out of shame but as a choice, David found himself wondering if there was more to marriage than just the cold logic of duty. As the evening wound down and the guests began to retire for this night, David found himself unable to escape the quiet questions that swirled in his mind. He had to know more about her, about Anna. Who was she really? What did she want? And what was behind the veil she refused to remove? It wasn't long before David found himself standing in the hallway outside his study. He didn't know what had come over him, but he needed to speak to Anna again. He needed to break the silence, to push past the walls they had both built between them. He wasn't sure if it was out of curiosity or something deeper, but he had to confront it. The need to understand was consuming him. The hallway was dimly lit, the shadows stretching long along the floor. David hesitated for only a moment before he knocked on the door to Anna's room. There was a soft sound from the other side, and then she appeared. She was dressed in a simple robe, her hair falling loosely around her shoulders. But it was her presence that struck David most. Calm, assured, and entirely unbothered by the veil that still covered her face. "Anna," David said, his voice soft. "Can we talk?" She regarded him quietly for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. They stood there for a moment, neither speaking, just taking in the silence that stretched between them. Anna had not yet spoken, but David could feel the weight of her gaze on him, as if she were waiting for him to speak first. So he did. "You don't owe me anything," he began, his words careful, measured. "But I can't help but feel like there's more to this marriage, to us. You're not just a business arrangement to me, and I don't want you to think that. But you also have to understand, I don't know who you are. Not really." Anna took a step closer, her hands folding delicately in front of her. Her posture was still perfect, yet there was a softness to her that David had never noticed before. "I understand," she said. "I understand your frustration, but I can't just reveal everything at once. Not when we're still strangers to each other. But I can promise you, David, that I'm not hiding from you. I'm just waiting for the right time." David nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what to make of her words. There was something about her that intrigued him, and the more time he spent with her, the more he found himself wondering whether the marriage that had been forced upon them could be something more. As the days passed, David found himself observing Anna more closely. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. She had a quiet dignity about her that was impossible to ignore, but it was her intelligence that truly captivated him. He had assumed she would be nothing more than a pretty face behind the veil, someone who had been chosen for the marriage, for her family's reputation, but she was so much more. Her insights into the family business, which David had initially dismissed, were sharp, thoughtful, and deeply perceptive. He found himself consulting her on matters he would have previously kept to himself. Slowly he began to realize that there was more to this woman than the mysterious exterior she had created. She wasn't just someone who had been chosen for him. She was someone who, despite the veil, had a depth of character and strength that he hadn't anticipated. One evening, they found themselves alone in the study, reviewing a proposal for the Whitman business. David glanced up from the papers to find Anna watching him, her gaze calm and steady. "What are you thinking?" he asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Anna hesitated for only a moment before responding. "I think we've been looking at this all wrong," she said. "You're approaching it with logic as usual. But what if we looked at it from a human perspective? What if we considered how this will impact the people involved? The clients, the employees?" David's eyes widened slightly as he absorbed her words. He hadn't thought of it that way. He was so used to running things through the lens of business, of profit and loss, that he had forgotten about the people who would actually be affected. Her perspective was eye-opening, and for the first time he saw her not just as a woman he was married to by obligation, but as an equal, as someone who could challenge him in ways that no one else could. The weight of everything shifted in that moment. He was no longer just the heir to the Whitman fortune. He was no longer just a man resigned to a loveless marriage. He was beginning to see Anna in a new light. And for the first time he realized that he was beginning to care about her, not just out of obligation, but because she had shown him a new way of seeing the world. David had come into this marriage with the idea that it was a transaction, but as the days passed, it was becoming clear that it was much more than that. It was a chance for him to grow, to challenge his own assumptions, and perhaps in time to truly understand the woman who had once been nothing more than a mystery. And so as he sat there looking at Anna across the table, he realized that the future was no longer something that had been dictated to him. It was something he had the power to shape, and it was a future that he was ready to explore with Anna by his side. David sat in the dimly lit study of the Whitman estate, the soft flicker of the fire casting long shadows on the walls. His mind was a labyrinth of questions, all leading back to one central truth. He had been living a life dictated by others. His parents had chosen his path, laid out his future, and arranged a marriage that, for all intents and purposes, had seemed like little more than a corporate merger. But now the walls he had built around himself, walls constructed from anger, frustration, and the desire to be free, were beginning to crumble. They had begun to fade ever so slightly, letting in cracks of light, and those cracks were pointing him towards something he hadn't anticipated, the possibility of change. It had been days since Anna had spoken to him in a way that left him shaken. Her words echoing in his mind long after they had parted that evening. She had said, "I'm not hiding anything. This veil is simply a part of me. It's not about hiding. It's about choice." At the time, David had dismissed it, thought of it as just another thing he didn't understand. But as the days passed, he realized it was more than just a piece of cloth. It was an expression of autonomy, an assertion of control, and perhaps more than anything, it was a reflection of Anna herself. A woman who would not be defined by the expectations of others, who refused to be reduced to something that could be neatly categorized or consumed. She wore that veil because it gave her power. And in some ways, it was that power that both intrigued and terrified him. He had been so focused on the physical barrier that the veil created that he hadn't stopped to wonder about the person behind it, the woman who had become his wife. Though the term still felt foreign to him, was not simply a passive participant in the arrangement. She was someone who was actively shaping her own narrative, creating her own identity, even in the face of everything that had been decided for. She had stepped into a role that David had been forced into but had not yet fully embraced. What would it be like to truly understand her? To see beyond the veil she wore and into the depths of who she really was? The truth hit him with an uncomfortable force. He had never truly seen her. He had never truly tried to understand her. From the moment he had met Anna, he had been fixated on the surface, on what she wasn't showing, on the way she didn't conform to his expectations. He had seen her as a mystery, something to be solved, someone to be figured out. But what if the mystery was not in what she was hiding, but in what he had been too blinded by his own pride and arrogance to look for? What if the truth wasn't beneath the veil, but in the way she carried herself? What if the truth lay in her actions, in the way she made decisions, in the way she looked at the world? That was the part that had always eluded him, the part that had kept him at arm's length from truly understanding who Anna was. His father had always told him to be practical. His mother had always told him to follow the rules. And David had done that. He had played his part in the Whitman family legacy. But somewhere along the way, he had lost himself in that role. He had become the heir, the businessman, the dutiful son, and in the process, he had forgotten what it meant to be human. He had forgotten what it meant to truly see someone for who they were, beyond the roles they were assigned or the titles they wore. And now here he was, married to a woman he barely knew, living in a world where duty came first, where emotions came second. It was a world he had been born into, one that he had never questioned. But that world felt suffocating now. The walls of the Whitman estate, the weight of his family's expectations, they felt like they were closing in on him. It was the kind of pressure that made him feel as if he could never truly be himself. His desires, his aspirations, they didn't matter. Only the legacy of the Whitman name mattered. He stood up abruptly, the sharp scrape of his chair against the floor breaking the silence. The fire in the hearth crackled, its warmth contrasting with the coldness that seemed to have settled in his chest. He couldn't stay in the study any longer. His thoughts were too loud, too jumbled. He needed to clear his head. David walked to the large window that overlooked the estate's sprawling gardens. The view was breathtaking, the stars twinkling in the sky, the moon casting a silvery glow over the grounds. But even the beauty of the night couldn't bring him peace. He felt a restlessness inside of him, a sense that something was slipping away, something he could not name but could not ignore either. His marriage, his family's legacy, his entire life up until now. It all seemed like it was crumbling, like a house of cards ready to fall apart at the slightest touch, and he didn't know what to do about it. His thoughts returned to Anna, to the way she had looked at him that evening, to the way she had calmly dismissed his questions, to the way she had told him that she wasn't hiding anything. Maybe she wasn't hiding anything at all. Maybe it was he who had been hiding from the truth, from the reality that the life he had been given was not the life he had chosen. And now, for the first time, he was faced with the possibility of change. But how could he change? He had been taught all his life that his duty was to the family, to the business, to the future. There had been no room for personal desires, for individual dreams. He had been groomed to be the perfect Whitman heir. And yet, now that he was faced with the reality of his marriage, he realized that all the things he had been trained for, everything he thought he wanted, had only brought him emptiness. He turned away from the window, his gaze landing on the desk in the corner of the room. The papers that had been left out, contracts, reports, proposals, seemed to mock him, to remind him of the life he had built but no longer wanted. What good? Was all this wealth, all this success, if it meant nothing in the face of a life that felt so hollow? What good was the Whitman legacy if he was miserable? His mind raced as he thought about the future. His future. Would he continue to follow the path laid out for him by his parents? Would he continue to marry a woman he didn't know for reasons he didn't understand and live a life of duty without joy? Or would he take a risk? Would he step into the unknown and challenge the legacy that had been thrust upon him? David didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing. He couldn't live the rest of his life in the shadows of the Whitman name. He couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine when inside he was suffocating. Something had to change. The next day, he found himself standing outside Anna's room once again, a sense of urgency in his steps. The veil that had been between them, both literally and figuratively, needed to come off. He couldn't keep living in this state of uncertainty, in this place where everything was about appearances. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The door to her room opened before he could knock, and there she stood, as graceful and composed as ever. Her veil was still in place, but David didn't care about that anymore. The veil wasn't the problem. The problem was him, his inability to see beyond his own expectations and fears. "Anna," he said, his voice low but firm, "I need to talk to you." She didn't say anything at first, just stepped aside to let him in. David walked past her, feeling the weight of the silence between them. She closed the door behind him and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "About what?" she asked, her voice steady but quiet. David paused, then slowly turned to her. "About us. About this marriage. About everything." Anna tilted, her head slightly as though contemplating his words. "What about it?" "I don't know who I am anymore," David confessed, his voice rough. "I've been living my life according to other people's rules, other people's expectations. And I've been so focused on the future that I've forgotten about the present. I've forgotten about you." Her eyes softened, and for the first time David saw something other than the calm, composed woman he had come to know. There was vulnerability there, just beneath the surface. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, David," Anna said quietly. "You don't have to change everything in one moment, but you do need to see what's right in front of you. I'm not just a part of this arrangement. I'm a person with my own dreams, my own life, and I'm willing to share that with you, but only if you're willing to truly see me." David's chest tightened as her words sank in. He had been so focused on his own frustration, on his own dissatisfaction, that he had never taken the time to see her as she was. He had never stopped to ask who she truly was beyond the veil, beyond the expectations placed on them both. "I want to see you," David said, his voice steady now. "Not the woman my family wants me to marry. Not the woman with the veil. I want to see the real you, Anna. All of you." Anna smiled, her eyes glinting with something that resembled hope. "Then let's start there," she said softly. And in that moment, David knew that everything was about to change. For the first time, he was ready to embrace it, ready to see beyond the surface, to see what was hidden beneath, and to build something real with Anna. Something that wasn't about duty, something that was about them. David sat alone in the study, the soft hum of the city outside failing to penetrate the deep silence that surrounded him. The weight of his thoughts seemed to echo in the empty room, the vast space of the Whitman. estate only adding to the feeling of isolation he had been carrying with him. The fire in the hearth flickered weakly, casting long soft shadows on the walls, but even its warmth seemed incapable of easing the chill he felt deep inside. It had been a week since his conversation with Anna. A week since he had made the decision to stop hiding behind his anger, to stop trying to push away the reality that had been forced upon him. He had promised himself that he would try to see her for who she was, not just the woman in the veil, but the woman who had made her own choice to wear it. A woman who had her own life, her own dreams, her own purpose, none of which had anything to do with the Whitman name, the empire, or the expectations that had shaped David's entire existence. And yet here he was, still sitting in the study, unable to move forward. David's mind kept returning to the same thoughts. Thoughts about Anna, about their marriage, about everything he had once believed. He had spent his entire life doing what was expected of him, following the script written by his parents, by society, by the family name. But for the first time, he found himself questioning everything. His own actions, his decisions, his sense of self. What had it all been for? The Whitman legacy, the empire his father had built, the wealth and power. It all seemed meaningless now. He had inherited a future he didn't want, a life he didn't choose, and a wife he barely knew. A wife who wore a veil and chose silence over words. But there was something about her that kept him coming back, something that made him feel like he was missing a piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just the mystery of her veil that intrigued him anymore. It was her quiet strength, the way she stood firm in the face of everything that had been thrust upon her. It was her ability to hold herself together, even when everything around them seemed to be falling apart. Anna was not what he had expected. She wasn't just a figurehead in a marriage of convenience. She was someone who had built her own life, even in the shadow of the expectations placed on her. She was a woman who had refused to let anyone define her, who had chosen to live by her own rules, even if those rules meant wearing a veil to keep the world at bay. David rubbed his hand over his face, exhaustion settling heavily into his bones. He had spent so much time focusing on what was missing, the love he had never been able to find in his arranged marriage, the life he thought he was meant to live, that he had failed to see the one thing that had always been right in front of him. Anna. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he moved toward the window. The lights of the city below twinkled in the darkness, a stark contrast to the stillness of the room. His eyes scanned the skyline, but his mind was far away, lost in the thoughts of everything that had led him to this moment. He had been born into a world where duty came first, where choices were made for him, where he was expected to fulfill his family's expectations. But what about his own desires? What about his own future? He looked down at his wedding ring, the symbol of a marriage that had never been about love. It had always been about business, about securing alliances, about ensuring the future of the Whitman name. But as he stared at the simple band, a thought struck him with startling clarity. He had been so consumed by the expectations of others that he had forgotten how to live for himself. He had allowed himself to be molded by a legacy that he hadn't chosen, a legacy that now seemed to hold him prisoner. David turned away from the window, his resolve hardening. He couldn't keep going like this. He couldn't keep living a life where everything was dictated by someone else. He had to take control. He had to stop allowing his family's legacy to define him. He had to find a way to break free. Free from the expectations, free from the marriage that had been arranged for him, and most importantly, free from the fear that had kept him trapped in this life. The next day, David knew what he had to do. He needed to talk to Anna. He needed to understand her. He needed to know who she really was beyond the veil, beyond the formality of their marriage. He had made a promise to himself that he would try to understand her, and it was time to follow through. He wasn't sure what would come of it, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to this marriage than he had originally thought. There was something about Anna that had the power to change everything. David knocked softly on the door to her room, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he knew that this moment, this conversation, was crucial. There was a feeling in the air, a tension that he could almost taste, as though everything in his life had led up to this moment. Anna opened the door, her calm expression unchanged, though there was a flicker of something, curiosity perhaps or something deeper, that passed across her face as she saw him standing there. "David," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Is everything all right?" "I need to talk to you," David said, his voice low but firm. "It's important." Anna stepped aside to let him in, and David entered the room, the door closing softly behind him. The room was as quiet and serene as ever, the dim light of the lamps casting a warm glow on the elegant furnishings. Anna stood near the window, her back to him as she gazed out at the estate grounds. David hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his thoughts. "About us, about this marriage, about everything that's been happening." Anna turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "What about it?" she asked quietly. David took a deep breath, his hands clasped together in front of him. "I don't want to live like this anymore," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I don't want to live a life that's been planned for me. I don't want to marry someone I don't know just because my family expects me to. I've spent my entire life doing what other people want, and I can't keep doing it. I need to know who you are, not just the woman in the veil. I need to know you." For a long moment, Anna said nothing. She simply stood there, her gaze steady, her hands folded neatly in front of her. But then slowly she nodded. "I understand," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I understand your frustration. But you have to understand, David, that this marriage was never just about you or me. It's about both of us. It's about what we choose to make of it." David stepped forward, his heart beating faster. "I want to make something of it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to understand you, Anna. I want to know what's beneath the surface, what's beyond the veil. I don't want to keep living like this, pretending that everything is fine when it's not. I want to change, but I need you to meet me halfway." Anna's eyes softened, and for the first time, David saw a flicker of vulnerability in her gaze. "I never wanted to hide from you," she said softly. "But I needed to know that you could see beyond the surface, beyond the expectations, beyond the veil. I needed to know that you could see me for who I really am, not just for the role you think I'm supposed to play." David felt a lump rise in his throat as he took in her words. For the first time, he realized how much he had been focused on his own pain, his own frustration, that he hadn't stopped to consider hers. She wasn't hiding from him. She was waiting for him to see her. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with regret. "I've been blind. I've been so focused on everything that I couldn't see what was right in front of me." Anna nodded slowly. "We all have our blind spots, David. The question is whether we're willing to see past them." David took her hands in his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "I want to see you," he said, his voice steady and full of conviction. "I want to understand you, to learn about you, to see the real you. Not just the woman in the veil, but everything that makes you who you are." Anna's lips curled into a soft, almost imperceptible smile. "Then we'll start there." David smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. It was a small step, but it was the first real step towards something he had longed for without even realizing it. They had a long way to go, but for the first time, David felt like he was on the right path. As he stood there holding Anna's hands, David knew that their marriage, this journey they were about to undertake, wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time, he felt like it was worth fighting for. And, with Anna by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. The veil, the mystery, the expectations. They were all still there, but they no longer defined him. They no longer defined them. What mattered now was the truth. The truth that lay beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. And David was finally ready to uncover it. David stood by the window of his private study, gazing out at the sprawling estate. The evening sky was slowly darkening, casting shadows across the garden. The estate was a symbol of his family's power, their legacy, but to David it felt more like a gilded cage. His fingers brushed lightly against the glass as if he were searching for something just beyond his reach. He couldn't shake the unease that had been gnawing at him since that night, the night he had confronted Anna, the night they had begun to strip away the layers of what had been carefully constructed. The conversation they had shared still echoed in his mind. The truth Anna had shared, the vulnerability behind the veil, had stunned him in ways he didn't fully understand yet. He had known for a long time that his life had been a series of obligations, that his choices had been constrained by the weight of family expectations, but he had never before felt the sheer force of those chains. They weren't just made of money and power. They were made of silence, of unspoken rules, of family legacies that kept him locked in a role that wasn't even his own to choose. But as he thought about Anna, about her words and the way she had challenged him to see beyond his own narrow vision of the world. Something inside him shifted. She had seen through the veil, but more than that, she had seen through him. She hadn't just accepted the life that had been handed to her. She had actively chosen how she would navigate it. She had carved her own path, and now, for the first time, David realized that he was standing at the edge of his own. He had been given a choice, one that he had never allowed himself to fully acknowledge. He had spent his entire life adhering to the rules, but in the face of Anna, he saw a different possibility. A life that wasn't dictated by others. A life where he could choose for himself. A life that didn't come with strings attached. But the road to that life was anything but easy. David turned from the window, his eyes falling on the desk where the legal documents and contracts for the merger sat untouched. He was tired of them. Tired of the business deals, the numbers, the endless expectations of his father and the family legacy. For years he had put his heart and soul into maintaining the empire. But what had it brought him? More wealth? More power? More emptiness? He couldn't help but feel like he was living someone else's dream, not his own. As he sank into the leather chair behind the desk, his mind wandered back to Anna. She had always been the enigma in their marriage, the woman behind the veil who had seemed so distant and unreachable. But that night, when she had spoken so honestly, he had seen the cracks in the walls she had built around herself. And for the first time, he had seen that perhaps she wasn't the only one with walls. Maybe he had been hiding behind his own, too. David had spent so much time fighting against the life his parents had planned for him, rebelling against the idea of being nothing more than a cog in the machine of the Whitman legacy. But what had he done instead? He had built his own set of expectations, his own rules, his own limitations. He had convinced himself that his marriage to Anna was just another duty, another burden to bear. But now, the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it had never been just about that. It had been about learning how to be seen, how to truly see someone else, and how to accept that there could be more to life than just what had been handed to him. He picked up the glass of whiskey that sat on the corner of the desk, swirling it gently as he stared down at the amber liquid. There were times when the weight of it all felt unbearable. The pressure to succeed, to uphold the family name, to continue the cycle of ambition that had been passed down from generation to generation. His father, a man whose expectations were as high as the empire he had built, had always made it clear that failure was not an option. But David had realized that the fear of failure had kept him from living. It had kept him from choosing his own path. It had kept him from being free. His thoughts turned once more to Anna. In many ways, she was just as trapped as he was. The expectations on her, the traditions of her family, the role she had been forced to play, they were all just as suffocating as the ones he had been handed. But Anna had found a way to carve out her own space within that. She had chosen to be a partner in the marriage, not just a pawn. She had chosen to take control of her own identity, to define herself on her own terms, even if that meant hiding behind a veil. David took a long drink from his glass, the burn of the whiskey doing little to numb the emotions that swirled within him. He knew he had to do something, to make a decision that would change the course of his life. He could no longer live as a man torn between his family's expectations and his own desires. He had to take the first step, even if it meant challenging everything he had been taught. He had to see Anna, truly see her, for who she was beyond the roles they had been assigned. The next morning, David awoke with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. He had spent too long burying his feelings, suppressing his desires, hiding behind the walls of obligation and duty. He had spent too long trying to please everyone else at the cost of his own happiness. But no more. He knew now that he couldn't continue down the same path. If he wanted to build something real, something that was truly his, he had to make a change. He had to step into the unknown, step into the world beyond the empire he had inherited, and face the future with Anna by his side. He found her in the garden, the early morning sun casting a soft glow over her as she walked along the winding path, her veil still in place. But today, for the first time, David didn't see the veil as a barrier. Today he saw it as a symbol of the choices she had made, the strength she had cultivated, and the woman she had become despite everything that had been thrown her way. Anna, he called, his voice steady, but filled with the weight of everything he had been holding inside. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time, David saw the vulnerability that lay beneath the calm exterior. She had always been so composed, so sure of herself, but in that moment he realized how much she had been carrying. "David," she said, her voice soft but open. "What is it?" He walked toward her, each step bringing him closer to the truth he had been avoiding. "I've been thinking," he began, his words coming slowly, carefully. "I've been thinking about us, about this marriage, about everything." Anna didn't speak, but he could see the understanding in her eyes. She had known this moment was coming, had known that sooner or later, David would have to confront the reality of what they were. "I've spent so much time trying to live up to other people's expectations," he continued, his voice tinged with regret. "Trying to be the man they wanted me to be, the heir to the Whitman legacy, the perfect son. But I've never stopped to think about what I want, what we want. And I can't keep going like this. I can't keep living a life that's been chosen for me. I need to know who you are, Anna. I need to understand who we are together." For a moment, Anna didn't answer. She simply stood there, her gaze unwavering. But then slowly she reached up and removed her veil. David's breath caught in his chest as she stood before him, her face fully exposed for the first time. It wasn't a grand reveal, no dramatic gesture. It was quiet, simple and profound. And as she looked at him, he saw her clearly. Her strength, her grace, her intelligence, and most of all, her courage. "I've been waiting for you to see me," Anna said softly, her voice steady but filled with a tenderness that David had never heard before. David's heart clenched. In that moment, everything clicked. He had spent so long focusing on the surface, on what he couldn't see, that he had failed to understand the depth of what was right in front of him. Anna had always been more than what he had imagined, more than just a woman in a veil. She had been the partner he never expected, the woman who had stood by him through everything, even when he didn't fully understand her. "I see you, Anna," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm sorry it took me this long." Anna smiled, a soft, knowing smile. And David realized then that they had both been waiting for the same thing. The chance to truly see each other, to finally acknowledge the person standing before them. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt. But for the first time, David felt ready to face them. With Anna by his side, they would build something real, something that was theirs. And as they stood together, the weight of their past slowly lifting, David knew that they were both ready to take the next step. Together. The morning sun was already beginning to cast its golden rays across the vast estate, the birds chirping outside, bringing a sense of peace to the otherwise silent mansion. David sat on the edge of the grandiose bed in their private suite, the silence around him a stark contrast to the thoughts racing through his mind. It had been months since he had taken the step to confront the reality of his life. Months since. He had chosen to see Anna for who she truly was, not just the woman in the veil, but the partner, the woman with dreams and desires of her own, and most importantly, a life separate from the expectations of their families. His gaze flickered over her. To Anna, who stood by the window, her figure bathed in the soft light of the morning. She was once again wearing her veil, though it wasn't a shield anymore. It wasn't something that kept her hidden from him or anyone else. It had simply become a part of her, something that marked the journey she had taken in her life to navigate this world with grace and strength. For the first time, David didn't see the veil as an obstacle between them. It wasn't a wall, it was a symbol of her autonomy, the way she had chosen to live her life, the way she had set her own terms. It was something that made her who she was. David had spent so much of his life resisting the expectations of his family, his place in the world, and the life that had been thrust upon him. He had spent years hiding from the truth of who he really was, as if he could outrun his own destiny. But now, as he sat here, in the quiet of their suite, he realized that he had been running from the wrong thing. He had spent his life avoiding vulnerability, avoiding the pain that came from truly allowing himself to feel. He had hidden behind a mask, just as much as Anna had worn hers. But in the months since their marriage had truly begun, since the walls between them had started to break down, he had realized that vulnerability was not a weakness. It was where true strength lay. He had underestimated Anna from the very beginning. When their marriage had been arranged, he had seen her as nothing more than another cog in the wheel of the Whitman legacy, a woman he would have to marry out of obligation. But now, the more time he spent with her, the more he understood that she was not just a figurehead in a family arrangement. She was a woman with her own mind, her own heart, and her own ambitions. She had chosen to be a part of his life, but it wasn't because of the family legacy or some grand plan for business. She had chosen him because she saw potential in him, in them. She had seen something he hadn't been able to see himself. But, even now, As they had come to understand each other more deeply, David still felt the weight of the past pressing on him. The Whitman legacy, the empire, the expectations of his family. It was still there, always looming in the background. He had tried to escape it, to push it away, but he knew now that he couldn't completely run from it. He couldn't sever the ties that had bound him to the past. But what he could do was find a way to build a future on his own terms. He could choose how he lived, how he loved, and how he shaped the legacy of the Whitman family, not by following in the footsteps of those who had come before him, but by creating his own path forward. David's thoughts were interrupted by Anna's soft voice. "You're quiet this morning." He looked up at her, meeting her eyes. The same calm, composed gaze he had become so accustomed to, yet there was something more in her eyes now. Something that spoke of patience, of understanding, and of a willingness to move forward together. "I'm thinking about everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "About us. About the life we're building. It's not what I expected." She moved toward him, her movements graceful and deliberate, and sat down beside him on the bed. Her presence was calm, yet there was a strength to it that made David feel grounded, as if everything was going to be all right, even when the world around them seemed uncertain. "I didn't expect it either," she said softly, her hand resting gently on his. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth it." David's heart swelled with emotion at her words. He had come to understand her in ways he had never thought possible. She was more than just his wife, more than just the woman he had been forced to marry. She was his partner, his equal. She had shown him a new way of seeing the world, a new way of living. She had shown him that there was more to life than power, wealth, and family legacy. There was love. There was understanding. There was connection. "I want to be worthy of you," David said quietly, the weight of his words hanging in the air between them. "I want to be the man you believed in, the man you saw potential in." Anna smiled gently, her fingers brushing against his cheek. "You already are, David," she said softly. "You just need to see it for yourself." Her words hit him harder than he expected. For so long, he had been looking outside of himself for validation, for approval. He had sought to live up to the expectations of others, to meet the standards set by his family, by society, by the legacy of the Whitman name. But in that moment, sitting next to Anna, he realized that the only approval that mattered was his own. The only person he needed to be true to was himself. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, his voice filled with the sense of uncertainty. "But I know I want to face it with you." Anna's smile widened, her eyes softening. "Then we'll face it together," she said, her voice firm and filled with the kind of quiet resolve that David had come to admire in her. In the weeks that followed, David and Anna's relationship continued to grow and evolve. They began to open up to each other in ways they hadn't before. The distance that had once existed between them, both physical and emotional, started to fade. They talked about everything. The challenges they faced, the dreams they had for the future, and even their fears. It wasn't always easy. They still had their moments of doubt, of frustration, but they learned how to communicate, how to listen to each other, and how to support one another in ways they had never thought possible. David's relationship with his family, particularly with his father, remained complicated. His father's expectations were still a heavy weight around his shoulders, but David had learned how to navigate those expectations without allowing them to define him. He was no longer willing to sacrifice his own happiness for the sake of the Whitman name. He had come to realize that his true legacy was not in the empire his father had built, but in the life he was creating with Anna. Together, David and Anna began to forge a new path, one that combined their strengths, their ideas, and their vision for the future. Anna's intelligence and insight had proven to be invaluable in their business dealings, and David had come to respect her perspective in ways he had never imagined. They worked together as a team, making decisions that reflected their shared values and priorities. But more than anything, David had learned that love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about fitting into a mold or living up to someone else's expectations. It was about seeing each other for who they truly were, accepting each other's flaws and strengths, and choosing to grow together. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony overlooking the estate, David turned to Anna, his heart full of gratitude. "I never thought I could feel this way," he said softly, his voice tinged with emotion. "I never thought I could feel at peace with everything." Anna turned to him, her eyes soft and filled with warmth. "That's because you're finally seeing the truth," she said. You're finally seeing what really matters, Adis smiled, the weight of the past lifting off his shoulders. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time he felt like he was ready to face it. With Anna by his side, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, and that was enough. As they stood there looking out at the horizon, David realized that the greatest lesson he had learned was not about power, wealth, or legacy. It was about love. The kind of love that doesn't come from obligation or expectation, but from mutual respect, trust, and the willingness to grow together. It was a love that transcended the roles they had been given, a love that allowed them to build something real, something true. And in that moment, as they stood side by side, looking out at the future they would create together, David knew that this was just the beginning. Their journey had only just begun, and with Anna by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. Together. This story is a powerful reminder that true growth and fulfillment come from stepping outside of our comfort zones and embracing vulnerability. David's journey from living for the expectations of others to finding his own path is a testament to the transformative power of self-awareness and open communication. It shows us that love, respect, and understanding are the foundation of any meaningful relationship, whether it's with a partner, family, or ourselves. The moment we stop living for others and start living for what truly matters, we unlock the potential to live a life that is not only successful but deeply fulfilling. David learned, the key to true connection lies in seeing each other for who we truly are, not for the roles society or family have assigned to us. It's through this process of truly seeing and being seen that we build relationships that can withstand any challenge. If this story inspired you and reminded you of the importance of growth, love, and being true to yourself, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support encourages us to keep creating more stories that inspire and connect us all. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and stay tuned for more.